And you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
People's Dispatch reports Burkina Faso, Guinea, and Mali propose strategic axis amid French military ouster. The three West African countries, all of whom have recently undergone military takeovers amid rising public anger against France, have agreed to a Bamako-Conakry Ouagadougou axis with enhanced cooperation on matters ranging from trade to the fight against insecurity. How serious of a coalition or arrangement is this? For insight, we turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery, Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So as France is getting ready to withdraw its troops from Burkina Faso by the end of the month, signs of a possible realignment in the region are emerging with this tripartite meeting between the foreign ministers of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Guinea. How significant is this, and is it overstating the significance by saying that this is a real pushback, not only to France, but this is a pushback to AFRICOM as well?
This is potentially significant. It also bodes well in terms of increasing consolidation. You know, of course, that there's the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, whose power is thought to be Nigeria, which will be having elections in a few weeks. But certainly the coming together of these three West African nations is a further signal and sign that Nigeria is not the only power within West Africa. Keep in mind as well that these West African states also have had complicated, complex relations with the North Atlantic powers. Recall that Guinea-Conakry, under its founding father, Sékou Touré, crossed swords with France early on. From France, the colonial power was withdrawing approximately 60-odd years ago. They were taking with them the toilets, the light bulbs, the typewriters. They were trying to cripple the economy. Keep in mind as well that the leader of independent Mali during the same period, Modibo Keita, came to a rather mysterious end with the hand of France suspected. Keep in mind as well that something similar happened to Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso, also coming to a mysterious end, also with the suspicion that despite internal ructions that were aimed at him, that France was ultimately behind this. And so when these nations come together, it is a signal that they are willing to stand up. And I should also say, as a major footnote, that these nations have had complicated relations with the Black Americans. Recall that when Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah was overthrown in February 1966, the U.S. ambassador was the former NAACP official Franklin Williams, who was in his overthrow. Nkrumah wound up in Guinea-Conakry subsequently, but at the same time winding up in Guinea-Conakry after the overthrow of Nkrumah was the Black American intellectual and former Howard University professor W. Alpheus Hutton, who embraced Nkrumah, embraced Sékou Touré. Let us hope that going forward in the 21st century, that Black Americans will be following the model laid out by Alpheus Hutton as opposed to that laid out by Franklin Williams.
Dr. Horne, the next article is by Alan McLeod, Mint Press News. The media ignores Seymour Hersh's bombshell report on Nord Stream 2. What's interesting is that Seymour Hersh has done some interviews, and one of them he said, this is only first base. There are more bombshells to come. Your thoughts?
Well, certainly, as we have said repeatedly, Congress needs to investigate, but it will be difficult for them to do so when the New York Times and the Washington Post, amongst other U.S. organs, are ignoring this bombshell story. I should also say that despite the fact that the United States has threatened the International Criminal Court based in The Hague, and recall that there's something believe it or not, called the Hague Invasion Act, which has threatened the ICC if they would be so bold and so adventurous as to try to indict the U.S. personalities and citizens. But we should not rule out some sort of action by the ICC, despite the timid leadership, because even though the United States has tried to avoid being a signatory, the fact that this criminal act took place outside the jurisdiction of the United States and involved countries that are signatories to the ICC treaty, that does not bode well. And recall that George W. Bush was so spooked by the idea of an ICC indictment because of his depredations in Iraq and elsewhere that he avoided a trip to Switzerland and changed his itinerary. Henry Kissinger has done the same thing. So let us keep this story alive, because hopefully it will act as a restraint on the more mulish and more ignorant aspects of U.S. imperialism.
In fact, to your point of keeping the story alive, we asked another guest earlier, and would like to get your take on this, because there has been basically radio silence by American outlets. Do you see, with the story getting traction, and Seymour Hersh is doing more and more interviews, particularly on foreign outlets, do you see how long do you think it is before Western outlets have to deal with this because their silence will be conspicuously absent?
Well, there is a predictable pattern with regard to these kinds of stories. First of all, there's nothing. There's crickets. There's ignoring of the rather far-reaching implications. The second stage is then an attack on Mr. Hersh personally, attack on his sourcing for this story, an attempt to say that he is in the pay of the Kremlin. And the third is the most difficult stage. That's when the accuracy of the story is accepted, at least in its implication. But of course, that oftentimes does not lead to an agonizing reappraisal of why there was nonfeasance and malfeasance in the first instance of the corporate media. Let us push aggressively towards the third stage, because quite frankly, this was an act of war. It could have easily tipped the small planet into World War III, and it needs to be taken quite seriously.
You know, Dr. Horne, there's an obvious question here. Since this is something, Ned Price, the U.S. government has been asked about, what's going on here? Did you do it? And they said, well, the European countries are investigating that. We're going to let them investigate it. But since this is an act of war, something that if it wasn't someone, well, ostensibly, I guess, outside of the so-called alliance, whatever the case, this is something that would trigger Article 5. So what the U.S. is saying is a member of our alliance has been attacked militarily. We'll just let the EU look into it. Something that could trigger Article 5. We're not really concerned about that. We'll just see how it works out. I mean, it is so blatantly obvious that they did it that it's getting to be it's farcical. It's kind of like the balloon story and the aliens. This whole thing is becoming a farce, Dr. Horne.
Well, when you refer to Article 5, obviously what you're referring to is the fact that there should be a collective response by NATO members against aggression. I don't think that Article 5 would rule out a collective response to a signatory to the NATO Charter.
That's correct.
U.S. imperialism. And I think also that we should keep a close eye on Turkey, Turkey, with regard to this story. It's a member of NATO. It is in the position to invoke Article 5. It has complicated relations with Washington, complicated relations with Germany and France and Britain and Canada too. And it is a country that has shown more independence than the other satrap nations, speaking, for example, of Great Britain and Canada in the first instance. And so if there's going to be any pushback with regard to Mr. Hersh's story, if it comes from anywhere within the NATO coalition, it will come from Ankara.
People's Dispatch reports Starmer bans Corbyn from running as a Labor candidate. Celebrated leftist and supporter of Palestine has been barred from running for office under the Labor Party following years of anti-Semitism accusations. What does this say to you, Dr. Horne?
Well, it's an example of demagogy at the highest levels of the Labor Party. It does not bode well for their ongoing attempt to oust the Tories from power. Certainly, Jeremy Corbyn is a staunch defender of Palestinian rights, and it does not bode well, once again, for the attempt of the Labor Party to oust the Tories from office when they capitulate to these right-wing sentiments. And certainly it does not speak well, I should also mention, for the pro-Israel lobby in London, because routing Jeremy Corbyn, obviously, it really weakens the struggle against anti-Semitism. It weakens the struggle against the right wing. And it's fair to say that some who are now within the pro-Israel lobby might find themselves victimized as the right wing gains in strength and power. I think that Mr. Stormer should obviously rethink this. And we should also think about the implications for the United States as well, where you've had similar demagogic invoking of anti-Semitism in order to discredit staunch defenders of Palestinian rights and self-determination.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. We greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.